Hello, this is Alex Birkett, and you're listening to the Long Game Podcast. In this episode, I'm talking to Bernard Huang. Bernard is the co-founder of ClearScope, an extremely popular content optimization tool. He also founded an SEO consultancy, Mushy Labs, and in his past played professional online poker, which during the episode will become apparent. Bernard has built and marketed ClearScope to the point where it's basically ubiquitous among the smartest content marketers and SEOs that I know. The tool is super amazing, and we use it with our clients. In this conversation, we're going to talk about poker strategy and systems and how these mental models can translate into business and SEO strategy and how they have for Bernard as he's built ClearScope. We also cover Bernard's process for learning new hard skills, such as sales and product growth, how he'd build a blog from scratch if he were to launch one today, and how to determine which clients or customers are the right fit for your business, and how to actually market to them once you know. This episode gives you a really good glimpse at how Bernard thinks about business, mental models, systems over kind of individual actions, and content marketing and SEO in general. And because of that, you're going to love it. Now, the first few minutes, we talk poker. I have a little poker game coming up with Bernard in a couple weeks, so I'm a little nervous, so I asked him his tips. It gets a little in the weeds here, so it's going to be super interesting to a select few people. Bill King. But past that, you're going to find tons of applicable lessons, even outside of the world of gaming. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Bernard Huang.
I think what's, stifling is when I feel like I don't have much freedom. I think that's the jarring part about stuff. It's as long as I'm having the freedom to do whatever I feel like doing for the most part, then I'm happy. And I think recently a lot of that is just sort of resting, sleeping, traveling, that sort of deal. But I don't know. Life is complicated, right?
Yeah. So it's more so we can just jump in. We don't have to start the podcast in any delineated clear way. So yeah. I'll just have it recording and we can kind of pick the point at which it makes most sense. But this is an interesting topic. You mentioned it's when it's you feel kind of constrained, when you feel a lack of freedom. So is that you're an entrepreneur. I feel like I've only known you as an entrepreneur. Is that why you picked that path, or how did that does that play into it?
Yeah, I suppose that's part of it, but I think that the other part of it that excites me about entrepreneurship is this it's sort of this meta, in that it's very rewarding for me to be able to make a bet on something. This ties into why I enjoy poker and fighting games, actually, to a certain degree, is that I get so much thrill from making a bet on an idea, a concept, something, and walking away from that bet being right, because the mode of thinking that I was in was correct. And I think that alongside this desire to forge my own path and do whatever I want, then culminates into more of a path finder type personality than, say, some people would make the analogy a bricklayer, is that somebody went and found the path, and then you need people to then go and build the road to the destination. So I find that that's what exhilarates me deep down inside, which is why I end up, at least in the past, starting a lot of things and being rather poor at following through, because I suffer from that shiny object syndrome. I'm oh, but there's a shiny object over there, and I drop this shiny object to chase after another shiny object, and sometimes a lot of the times without the follow through, the things don't go anywhere.
That's awesome. I have a ton of questions to follow that up. But first, did you say fighting games or
fighting games? Yeah. Like Street Fighter, Super Smash.
Okay, cool. I just wanted clarification there. So you mentioned betting in relation to poker and fighting games, and then betting in relation to the business context. Do you think those are the same style of bet? Because in my experience, it's like business, you almost need like this weird irrational conviction, whereas in games, you need maybe like a more objective mindset to pull yourself away and be able to drop things. Do you see any delineation there or difference, or how do you look at that?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think in games, which is why a lot of people find comfort in games, is that the rules and the system of the game are fairly constraining in that there's only a finite amount of possibilities that you can do because that's just like the rules of the game. Whereas in business, it's in some ways infinite because life is infinite and there's just all kinds of different possibilities. But I think that there is a lot of similarities as well because the fundamentals of business are product, market, business model, distribution, right? And of course, you can like kind of tweak these knobs to your favor to a certain degree. And I think like breaking down the fundamentals of business into simple concepts that then you play is a very like liberating feeling, or else it's easy to like drown in the infinite possibility, right? Oh, we could be doing this and we could be doing that and could be allocating resources there. And it's oftentimes paralyzing because you might go, well, there's all of these things. How do I choose like what is the right one? And then you start boiling it down to say, okay, well, customer acquisition costs have to be lower than lifetime value, or else, right, the business doesn't work. And then you can go, okay, well, what are the channels where we can like test to see, what customer acquisition costs are, and similarly, like how those customers, what are their lifetime values in association with the channel of distribution. So I think that breaking it down and making it into a system is probably one of my biggest takeaways actually from poker. I talk about it from time to time, but the gist of poker is that people are not losing poker players. People employ losing systems in poker. And that is like fundamentally how you improve at poker. Or now you could then extrapolate that and say at anything. Right?
When you say systems in poker, and I ask this because we're going to play poker in 2 weeks and I'm probably going to get crushed. Does that mean you have simple guiding heuristics, or am I like taking that word to mean something different? Like I know, like this is going to sound so dumb because I don't even know the terminology, but like where you are on the table, you're like either like offensive or defensive position, right? And you're going to like basically make the first bet in relation to that first position. And that's like basically a heuristic as part of a system. Is that what you mean? Or do you have like, what does a system mean in a poker context?
Yes. So a poker context in terms of a system is playing what poker players would call hand ranges. So you can imagine in a very simplistic model that if you're playing no limit Texas Hold'em, which is commonly what people associate poker with, you get dealt 2 cards. And when you look at pocket aces, you're like, wow, these are great, right? And when you get dealt 7-2 offsuit, people say, okay, you should probably get rid of that. So what then you could imagine is that in the position that you're in, which rotates based on just the game, that when you're very early to act, right? As in the first person to act, that would be what people call under the gun. And if you're the first person to act, you basically have to tell the rest of the table that I have a strong hand without anybody else indicating their information. So typically what you do is you play tighter, right? And so you can imagine that under the gun, you should play less hands because you have less information about everybody else subsequently to you. Now, in a system, you would say, okay, well, if I'm going to play less hands, maybe I'm going to play the top 10% of hands under the gun. In which case, you can go through and say, okay, pocket aces, yes, part of the top 10% of hands. 7-2 offsuit, not part of the top 10% of hands. And so you would then throw in different hands based on their strength, based on the position that you're at, right? And so when then you're, say, losing as a player, you might say, study your game and say, oh, I opened under the gun, right? First position to act with 5-7 suited, except 5-7 suited is not that good of a hand, right? It looks kind of cool, and then you played it, right? And so that would then be analyzing the system and saying that, okay, I played a top 30% hand in a position that I should have only been playing a top 10% hand. So that's like level one, like system poker is get your own hand ranges down, right? And know that if you're on the dealer button, which is the last to act ever, I guess like pre-flop, the big blind is the last to act. But if you're on the button and it folds around to you, you should probably be opening top 60, 70% of your hands because you just get to act last all of the time. And that's like positional. And then you can take that model and then flip it and say, okay, if Alex here or Bernard here understands poker systems, then he understands that he'll be playing tighter hands under the gun, right? So if I see you and you open under the gun, then, and I'm on the button and I'm looking at 5-7 suited, I might like call you in that position because I am A, last to act, and then B, I understand the system that you're in. And then some flop comes out, and this is what people will call like the first 3 cards. And they'll say it has a texture associated with it. So a texture, there's a dry and a wet, right? A dry is like king 7-2. So it's dry in the sense that the top 10% of hands are very binary when they hit a king 7-2. You either have an ace king, a king queen, a king jack, or you don't. So you have a good hand or a bad hand, and that's a dry board. And then there's like a wet board, which is usually a jack 10, and then maybe another Broadway like queen. So if it's queen jack 10 and you're opening top 10% of your hands, well, ace king is good, queen jack is good, jack 10 is good, king queen is good, right? So it's very wet in that you probably connected with that board at some point. So based on those different like flop textures, right, and based on what percentage of hands I think you're opening, then I could have a fairly good like expectation of where you sit on that like board, and then I can play your range rather than trying to say, oh, I think Alex has ace king here. I'd be like, well, his hand probably hits his range like 60% of the time. So with 5-7, I'm not going to bother. Whereas on a king 7-2, I have mid pair. And unless you have ace king, king queen, and like there's 16 combinations of ace king and king queen, like possibility wise, and with one king out, there'd be 12 combinations. So you could already see like the math on the system is then like, okay, 24 hand combinations, ace king, king queen, hit this board. And that's about all that you could have. Whereas the rest of the hands in the top 10%, which there'd be like 136 of those, don't hit this. So I could say with a fair amount of confidence that I should call you down, if not try to bluff you on the flop on a king 7-2, because probability-wise, you probably didn't hit it.
All right. So I'm definitely going to have to re-listen to this. I've got a lot more knowledge now than I had before I started. But one thing, so I'm going to try to relate to this to business too. But one thing I want to confirm, I may be reading too much into this because I'm also reading Annie Duke's book right now, How to Decide.
Okay.
So it's sort of divorced from poker. She obviously learned a lot of this through her poker days, but like it's sort of just a meta level. Like, how do you make good decisions? And like one of her points is like, you can't really determine the quality of a decision based on like one single outcome. So when you were saying like, you may start with a king pair and like maybe that hand loses, or like an ace pair, right? Like, and that's a good starter. Or like you could get that 7-2 and like you could get lucky and win, right? Like there's, multiple different variations of like the outcome versus the input. So this is a concept I think called resulting, right? When you basically like judge decisions based on the outcome, not necessarily the input data that you had. So when you're talking about building systems, is it like, are you talking about basically making better decisions based on input data, or better decision quality, not necessarily just looking at each individual outcome, and then like looking on a macro scale, is this moving in the right direction? Is the system working overall, not just one single point decision?
Absolutely. So it's like reevaluating the framework of thought that got you to the decision that ultimately could have been good or could have been bad, right? But really it's reviewing the framework, the model that your brain went through to say, okay, right, I am going to invest $50,000 in Google AdWords, right? It's like, how did you come to that decision, right? And it's like, oh, well, we ran a test, right, with $5,000 and we got back out $10,000. And it's like, okay, right, that makes a lot of sense as to why you'd want to then double your bet in Google AdWords. But if you just arbitrarily said, okay, let's make a bet on $50,000 and see where it goes, maybe that's okay too, because you just raised $50 million, and that's the kind of like bet sizing that you want to play with. But I think it's more, around the like, okay, what was the framework of thought that I had going into this? And is that a flawed framework of thought? Right. And basically challenging yourself on that continually, because there's so many, I think, like misconceptions that we as human beings are unconscious of, or perhaps conscious of, but don't want to change for whatever reason. And it's sort of just like, okay, is this thought that I have still relevant? And if that's guiding your decision process and it's not relevant or not working, then identifying that sooner gets you to your results faster.
Yeah, so I can definitely see this in the context of business now. I'm thinking about it from my domains, like my day job and experimentation. That's kind of the lens that I look at these things through, because it's such a system. It's every test has the probability to win, the probability to lose, and the probability to detect whether it's a winner or a loser. But then like the thing you can control is like the analysis of the test, right? But then like the ideas that you're putting forth in the first place and how you're prioritizing those. Yep. So in my day job, that's something that I'm trying to hammer home now, is instead of just putting random ideas on the board all across the website, all across the landing pages, let's hone in and figure out like a decision-making framework for how we bring test ideas in the first place. And then there's a couple of criteria that you can gauge, like, how certain this feedback is, or how certain this data is, that makes it a little bit more confident of a test. So it could be something like a heuristic. That's something that maybe you've seen patterns of this. Maybe it's social proof. You've seen this on case studies before work, or maybe it's qualitative research, right? Like that's a pretty high trustworthy piece of evidence too. Like if you've seen this in the data, if you've seen somebody on a survey say they're frustrated about this, or it could be that a subject matter expert is like, oh, this is actually how we should do things. Like those are all various degrees of certainty, and you can bring those to the table when you prioritize test ideas. And I look at it the same way when I do content strategy, actually. It's like there's multiple different ways you can build a system or a strategy based on those input variables of, how high is your domain rating? What industry are you in? What are your competitors writing about? And then you can basically take that keyword research data that everybody else has in Ahrefs or SEMrush, and you can use it. You can pipe it through your own decision-making framework to get better results on average. Not every piece is going to rank, but on average, you're hoping that is a better strategy.
Absolutely. And then and then, right, it's from there, obviously repeating it enough such that you have some amount of statistical certainty that your data is sound, and then being like, okay, did this work as planned, right? And I think that that's kind of where I view this emerging idea of tackling zero search volume intent to be very compelling. It's because we're seeing very low domain authority websites punch above their weight, right? Like ranking a lot higher for competitive queries that don't make that much sense unless you really scrutinize it. And it's like, oh, SEO is dead as like the title tag. And it's sort of this like perspective-based piece, and it does really well, or things to consider before doing X. And X having to be a very challenging sort of like subject matter, like training for a triathlon or starting a blog or starting your own business. And it's like, okay, by targeting that intent, then presumably we can rank faster, stronger, and better, then not have to weigh as much in our domain authority. And then you quickly like test that with 5 or 10 different pieces and say, okay, was that true or was that false? And then, right, this is back to the idea of like being a losing poker player, is that like people don't suck at content. They just employ a losing content strategy, right? And their content strategy that doesn't work. And they say, oh man, I'm like so bad at content. And it's like, no, like just the framework that you've been employing has not been effective. So let's like fix that and see whether or not our results change as a result of that particular shift in thinking.
You're speaking my language. That's what I always say is content programs fail based on strategy. People always point to like, oh, the content quality is not there. The content promotion's not there. And it's like, those are pieces that could like proliferate from a content strategy. But if your core assumptions are wrong, that's where it all breaks down. And you know what I see all the time is like this idea of like losing one hand and determining, oh, I'm a bad poker player. It's like you write 5 blog posts and you determine, oh, content doesn't work for us. Right. It's like, it's a long game. There's you need enough at bats. You need enough iteration to see like, oh, okay, this actually doesn't work. So I feel like that's one of the biggest mistakes that I see is just giving up too soon and treating it like a very short-term channel or test.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that it's like anything else. It's like when I approach anything new, I'm just like, okay, I'm going to suck at this for a really long time. And that's part of the process. So just accepting that you're going to suck at whatever it is that you do for a fair amount of time before coming to then understanding the true essence of what you're doing is something that I think people who are skilled at learning have already just completely internalized. And I remember very distinctly when we were getting ClearScope off the ground, I, as the non-technical co-founder, was tasked with customer development and finding, new customers and talking to them. And it was like a rough many, many months of just getting rejected left and right. And one day after work, after being, I guess, told no, like a lot of times, I just like remember going back to my apartment. I was like, man, this fucking sucks. But then I was like, okay, well, like what about it like sucks, right? And it's like, okay, well, like doing sales sucks. And I was like, okay, but why does doing sales like suck? And then I'm like, okay, maybe it's because like I suck at sales. Maybe it's because I actually don't like doing sales. Or maybe it's because I'm not finding success at sales, which I think is different than sucking at sales, right? It's sort of like an outcome versus like a skill or something like that. And so I was like, okay, well, this is very irritating and I'm very frustrated, but I'm not going to just jump to the conclusion that I hate this because it's not working, right? I have to like kind of rule out this idea that I hate this because I'm not good at it first. So I just kept going. I was like, okay, well, the only way to really validate that is to continually rule that out and get good at sales. So I got good at sales, and then it turned out, I was like, okay, this isn't actually that bad. I think I hated it because I wasn't succeeding at it, and I also sucked at it. And so once I started like really doing it well and succeeding at it, I was like, oh, okay, yeah. No, like sales is fine. But I was in a miserable place because I just wasn't good at it.
How did you get good at sales? Or was it simply a function of time and pressure?
That's certainly, I think, what kept me going. However, I think that, and this is like finally what I understand what school is trying to do. I was really crappy at school, graduated with like a 2.7 GPA, barely got out. But what books and mentors and school, I believe, are trying to instill in you as a person is shortcuts in learning, right? It's like trying to say, hey, I, through experience, studying, whatever, have learned that you shouldn't put your fingers on a hot stove. And so don't do it, right? But I feel like this is where, in my opinion, school fails you, is that for not you, but like a lot of different personality types, is that they don't really do a good job hammering home like the why and like whatever, right? They're just like, no, like, don't do that, period. And then, like it's on a test. It's like, should you do this? And you're like, no, false. We should not do that. But it doesn't really say like, okay, why shouldn't you do it? And so that's I think what you should do. What I like when I like go out now to like learn anything new, I go and I say, okay, like there are a crap ton of things that I know that I don't know about doing X. And the best way that I found for myself, and this is going to vary from person to person, is to go out and ask the people who are perceived to be the best at X that I can get a hold of and say, hey, I just want 15 to 30 minutes to get your eyes and ears on X, right? And as somebody who's been on the receiving end and somebody who's also been on the pitching end, there is a world of difference in the way that you ask that, right? It's like you can go in and be like, hey, Alex, I've been in SEO for the last 6 months and I've not been finding success. This is like the framework that I've like identified that people are talking about that I've been implementing. And for whatever reason, it's not working out. I have these different ideas about, like A, B, and C that I want to test. Could you spare 20 minutes to have a chat? And when you like see that sort of pitch, you're like, all right, like this person is worth talking to because they know my shit. And so, that's like what I do is like, I go, okay, for learning, I like then emailed a bunch of people and I was like, hey, how do you do sales? Right. And then I explained to them how I was approaching sales. I was like, okay, I'm identifying the right persona, the right type of company, doing this kind of segmentation. Then from a cold emailing perspective, I'm pulling their email from these sources, checking that those are valid emails with these different softwares, putting them into this like email sequencer. And then this is like my results. And people came back and they're like, yeah, like, wow, you should be teaching me how to do sales. And I was like, oh, okay, well then I guess we've like arrived at sort of the way to do that people are thinking about doing it. And so that's my opinion, is that for myself, I know that I learn a lot better through heuristics and experience and people. But I know some people who learn phenomenally through books or school or courses, right? And if that's your jam, it's like sort of go into those channels, understand what you're looking for in that particular time frame is to understand what you don't know about it, and then know that you're going to suck at doing whatever it is that you're going to do for a while before you can then make, I think, a accurate assessment about whether or not you actually like doing whatever it is that you were trying to learn or do.
That's awesome. That's really similar to how I've approached things in life. And actually, there's this book now that I still haven't read, but it's one of those where the title, I think, just says it all. Who, not how. So it's
Okay.
like, right, instead of figuring out how to do something, you think about, all right, who do I go to that's done this before?
Yeah.
And like maybe you learn from them, maybe you hire them, whatever it is, but you're thinking in terms of like the people that can help you with that problem. And that's something that I've always done just naturally because I'm like, well, it makes no sense to wade through all these books that I haven't validated. I don't know if I can trust. There's a big time sink. Who knows when I can just like tap somebody on the shoulder and then meet them for coffee or just get them over email and get that information firsthand. And then the second benefit of that is that you build a network, which is clearly important, especially if you're an entrepreneur, but for anybody. And you do so naturally. Like you don't have to go to networking events. You just kind of like one by one, like just have good, interesting conversations. And the other thing there too is like, it depends on the space you're in. I found marketing, a lot of the blog posts out there are kind of bullshit. Like it's just like not a lot of information. It's like a lot of fluff, right?
Yeah.
It's filtered through, a writer doing research that was written by other writers who haven't done the thing that they're writing about. So you're oftentimes not getting like firsthand information.
Yeah.
I found this firsthand when I was like looking for information on like how to write a welcome email. Every article starts with like, what is a welcome email? And, it's clearly written for SEO. And I'm like, no. I just want somebody who's done this to tell me how to do this. Right. But anyway, I'm ranting a little bit. If you go to a conference and get somebody at a happy hour, or if you go to coffee or to a lunch with somebody, you're usually getting pretty unfiltered information. It's quite a bit more honest. So I find that you can basically ramp up and basically take a shortcut to the firsthand knowledge that they have. So I love that model.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think after you've done it a few times, at least from my experience, you realize that like, it's, well, A, not that scary, and B, there really isn't that much to why somebody is really successful or good at X, Y, or Z. It's usually that they either got really lucky, worked really hard, or a combination of both. And that's like it. It's like, oh yeah, how did you get here? It's like, oh, well, I woke up and did the same thing for the last like 5 years. It's like,
it is true.
Okay,
it's like most things. I feel like most things are simpler than one would imagine in terms of like, at least they're not complex, but they're more difficult than people imagine. So it's like, it's simple, but difficult, but you listen to the, like, those success stories and you're like, oh, that's really straightforward. All right. Yeah. So I just have to do this. Yeah.
Yeah. That's commonly like it. Yeah. You might get, I think, some shortcuts or like mental models to help in certain places, which I think is good. Yeah, I guess, okay, maybe when I was thinking about it in terms of like marketing and sales, and like marketing and sales for the most part, I think like you just kind of try things rapidly and kind of test ROI, and it's all more or less kind of similar in fundamentals. But I could imagine how, I don't know, something like creating art would be a drastically different like mental model shift that is different than, okay, like, I worked really hard and got really lucky, perhaps, but I can't say.
That's probably true. Yeah, I'm not totally sure. I was also thinking programming may be the exception there, but I will say like through my small adventures in like, learning R and Python, I tried it for many years where I would go through Code Academy course after like book and like learn all the theory. And then I would barely be able to write a for loop. And then as soon as I just like stopped overthinking it, just started writing code and Googling shit. And then I got a code mentor, which is like the who, not how thing, who could basically look over my code and give me pointers as I was going along. Then I built things and it was like actually a lot more simple. Granted, my code was not world class, but it was a way that I actually like just, stopped thinking and put things out there. So I do think it actually probably does work for other modalities and other kind of industries too. I'm thinking about like playing guitar, right? Like you could learn theory, you could go to class, you could go to school and like sit there and like learn all the books. But at a certain point, you have to sit down and, hurt your fingers playing some chords.
Yeah. I sort of more or less does feel like, at least for myself, it's sort of like try it, then go find the who to, so that I have more like interesting things to talk about, and then go back and try it again. It like works really well for me, because I think if you just go and find a mentor and you're like, hey, teach me guitar, then they'll be like, okay, well, show me what you got. And if you're like, well, I got nothing, then there's like not a very deep conversation to be had. Whereas if you try it and you're like, okay, I'm struggling with, this shifting or whatever, then it's like, they might be able to say, hey, you're thinking about it wrong, right? The way to think about it is rhythm, not tone, or something like that. I don't know, right? I don't know anything about guitar.
So what does a day look like for you nowadays? Like what's a day in the life at ClearScope?
A day in the life at ClearScope. Yeah, I would say that it has drastically changed for me recently because we are a very small team. We were 3 people all the way up until the end of last year, which a lot of people thought was pretty crazy, and definitely was pretty crazy because I was the sole account manager for thousands of users on top of doing demos, support requests, all that like good stuff. And so brought in somebody to help with customer success who has been phenomenal and amazing, got up to speed in the last like 6 months really well. And then we brought in our first customer ever at ClearScope to help us with marketing at ClearScope, which were basically my 2 work identities all the way up until, well, now. Nowadays, I spend, I guess, a lot more time thinking more about the intangibles of everything. I think that it's easy for me to get lost in the numbers, the ROI, the experimentation, whatever. But what's been interesting to see play out is that really a lot of it is not in the numbers, right? A lot of it is in the qualitative, I guess, is the way that people would associate it, is the anecdotal, right? And I'm really interested in understanding sort of why people enjoy ClearScope over a swarm of competitive tools that have like entered the market, and why we have such like overwhelmingly positive feedback in comparison to other tools on the market, as far as I can tell from like competitive intelligence. So I'm way more interested in like thinking through brand, and also just understanding that it's everything sort of like a butterfly effect, which is weird to say, like coming from somebody who was really deep in experimentation, A/B testing, right? Statistical significance. It's sort of just like, oh, well, how does somebody like feel about this? And, why is like Lexus, why do people pay, a ton more money for a Lexus in comparison to a Toyota, right? It's functionally the same to get you from point A to point B, except people feel better when they're driving a Lexus to work or whatever, right? And so these days, I guess I'm like syncing with the team a lot more, trying to like kind of dial in on the intangibles of what we as a brand can do, which is probably the wildest swing away from like, segmentations and data and like whatever. But I think it is really important to be like asking ourselves these questions, especially because what we've seen is that competitor tools are coming in and they're saying, oh, we're like ClearScope, but cheaper. And also we do X, Y, and Z. Right. So people will then come to us and be like, oh, well, I checked out so-and-so and they're cheaper and they do Z. We care about Z or whatever. And then, I'll be doing a demo or kickoff call, because I still keep my hands in those, like from time to time, kickoff calls all the time. And I'm just like, okay, like, do we actually care about Z? Or is this just a bell or whistle that competitor X made up so that they could say that we're like ClearScope but cheaper and we do Z, right? Is this something that people actually care about? And most recently, there's like a lot of buzz about GPT-3, natural language generation. And everyone's kind of jumping on this like train of like, we will write content for you, whether that's entire sections of content, headings of content, questions of content.
This is like copy.ai, conversion.ai, all that stuff.
Yeah, but then SEO tools are taking their spin on that, like literally, and having content spinners pop up. And we're just like, okay, but is that actually what people want? Or is that cool? Or what people say that they want? Because as we've seen with just like the product category mature, people will come and be like, oh, we want X. And we'll be like, okay. And we will do X. And then later on, we'll like look at usage statistics. Be like, man, nobody uses X. Like people don't actually care about it. And then to a certain degree, this is what we found with like GPT-3 is like, A, it's actually not that good. And B, but B, itself. Like people are like, oh, copy.ai or conversion.ai, like, these are cool. And it's like, yeah, they are cool. So saying it is actually like important, but how much it contributes into like our platform doesn't seem to be that important. That's like what we found out recently. So we'll like say it on demo calls, be like, yeah, ClearScope uses GPT-3 to do some stuff. But then we've limited the scope of what it does to like a section within like a tab. So it does very little, but people just wanted to hear that like, oh, ClearScope does use GPT-3. And so it's weird. It's weird.
Yeah, I will say, like, as soon as I saw some of these companies come out, some of which are run by friends, I had this idea. I'm like, all right, I've got this little pet project, a couple side projects. I've got the shiny object syndrome too.
Of course.
I'm like, all right, what if I just like spun up, I've got a couple affiliate sites. I could just type 3 or 4 sentences about a blog topic, put it through one of these GPT-3 systems, put it into ClearScope, plug in the keywords that it doesn't have, and then just scale the shit out of this, like, hundreds of blog posts. And it's kind of like a content farm, but I don't even have to hire freelancers.
Right.
Doesn't work. Not at all. Not even close. So that dream is definitely like years away, probably. Right. So the promise is there. I think like these tools could be interesting for like short form copy.
Totally.
Or maybe things that aren't specific, but I had, technical articles on kava. It's like this plant root thing.
Yeah.
You'd put it through and it was just full of bullshit information. And I'm like, you can't publish that. So anyway, I that's a little digression in terms of like the efficacy of some of these things. But the question that I actually wanted to ask is like that you're doing all this branding stuff and this high level research and kind of thinking about how you guys differentiate. What answers have you come up with?
Yeah, it's a good question. The answers that we've come up with have been more questions, but some answers. So let's say, okay, right, if there's all this stuff and there's a lot of hype around content, there has been a lot of hype around content optimization. We have gotten, as most content optimization tools have, lots of customers. But, right, that's like saying, I think crypto is a good example in this particular case. That's like saying that, we just bought Bitcoin like a few months ago and it's done well. It's like, yeah, if you were in content optimization, you would have done well. But what we're thinking then is not the speculator who just buys Bitcoin, but who are our true fans, right? Who 5 years from now will still be holding Bitcoin? Is the question that we're asking ourselves now, right? It's like, okay, we have lots of businesses that, in my opinion, should likely not be optimizing content using a content optimizer. Like a good example would be like a small local business, right? Like a local plumber. I might go, oh, cool. Everyone's talking about content optimization. Then I'm going to use ClearScope to rank for plumber in Austin. And we would say, well, it's not going to help, but it's not really going to help because you don't rank for plumber in Austin by optimizing text on your page. You rank for it with local citations, nice reviews, all that good stuff. But there's a lot of those people, right, that are coming in and buying content optimization tools. And I think that what we've done well is we've tried our best to deter all the bad fits, right? Somebody comes in and they're like, Bernard, I want to buy ClearScope. And then, right, we'll go with the plumber example. I'll be like, but you're a local plumber, like local SEO and content optimization overlap maybe like 5 to 10% at best. Local SEO is generally citations, blah, 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 right? And then if they ultimately decide to buy, that's fine, because I feel like I did kind of go out of my way to say, hey, I don't think you're the best fit for our product. And so after they cancel, when they cancel, if they cancel, then somebody might go and say, hey, Bob, you tried ClearScope, like, how was it? And you can imagine that reaction that somebody has from the initial expectation setting, they might be like, oh yeah, like it was great. You know, we talked with the ClearScope team. They said it wasn't a great fit. I tried it, and yeah, lo and behold, it was not a great fit. But I think it could work really well for, you know, X, Y, or Z. Whereas you can imagine from another tool's perspective, that they just came in and like double your traffic in 3 months guaranteed. And Bob, the plumber, is like, okay, I'm going to do it. And then they go in with wrong expectations and they buy the product. And then somebody asks that Bob right now, like down the line, oh, how was your experience with that tool? And Bob be like, oh man, it freaking sucks, right? They said it was going to do X, Y, or Z. It just did not work at all. And you can see how that's a wildly different customer sentiment just from an expectation like setting perspective. So that was a long-winded way of saying, right, really trying to understand who our customer is and who our customer is not, right? And people who are not our true customers, when they have feedback, when they come in and they just say, I want to sign up, we're not going to say, no, you cannot sign up. We're going to say, look, we don't think it's the best fit. And then we have to be wary to say, okay, those same bases of customers who are actually not going to be our true customers 5 years from now, they're going to have feedback. They're going to be like, Bernard, we want the content to write itself. And then we have to look at that and say, well, no, I don't think you're like our true customer, right? You're here because of the hype. I have to wade through that noise and say, no, that's not right, right? Like the true customer is this like content strategist. And content strategists, like you have, you know, like a taste of that, is they're not going to say, yeah, I want the content to write itself. They're going to say, okay, how can I like be more effective at choosing the right like angle to position my content? How can I bring in, you know, the right structure and the right points? They're not saying, yeah, I want the content to write itself. So that's like one of the biggest questions with sort of the answer is that like, okay, we believe that content strategists are our true customer. And, you know, a content strategist can be an SEO that overlaps. It can be a content marketer that overlaps, and it can be a writer and that overlaps as well. And we say, okay, pure SEOs are not our customer because they're always trying to game the system. They're the ones thinking, oh, it would be cool if content could write itself, because then I could spin up 5 different affiliate websites with like barely little work. And we're like, yeah, but that's not going to work in the long haul.
So I love that. You're essentially looking for the ClearScope hodlers. And that's via like a process of elimination of sorts or exclusion, which I think a lot of people don't think about when they think about target audience. And it shows because you see these headlines that are like email marketing for everyone. It's like, nah, is it really? But yeah, like the thing about target audiences is you do have to learn how to say no. And it's difficult when there's a short-term gain in front of you, which is like, for our agency, we've been really critical about that because we have day jobs and we can't have bad clients. Like that's just like a time suck that's going to take us away from our own, you know, kind of lives and also those of like our other clients that we want to like crush it for. Yeah. So we've come up with little rules, and, you know, some of them are industry based or like, you know, what demographic or like firmographic data there are for clients. You know, so like they've got to be of a certain size, their traffic has to be this level, all that stuff. But we also have qualitative things on calls where once we hear them, we're like, Do we want this client? And those are the things that I kind of alluded to before, which is like when they look at it too much like a immediate test or like short-term performance channel, such as paid, or if they want to just dive in and have us write a bunch of content and they have no strategy in place and they're not willing to pay for strategy. I'm like, well, in those cases, we break amicably and say, actually, you should hire these freelancers. Here's a list of them. We're probably not right for you. You'll save a bunch of money, by the way, too, because we're using these freelancers anyway. But it's like it's almost confidence. Like you have to realize that like there's going to be more clients. This one's not right for you. And by saying no, it hurts in the short term because you might not make that, X amount of money, but in the long term, it's going to be good for you, which is all to say, the podcast name, you got to play the long game.
You got to play the long game. I totally. Yeah. And I think that we do have the benefit of not being venture backed and being profitable and small and happy as a team. And honestly, right, that's like we get a lot of downward pressure because people come in and they're like, wow, I hear amazing things about ClearScope, but it's simply out of my budget. And, we are the most expensive tool within content optimization. But the flip side, you can imagine, is that we say offer a lower tier plan. And I'm not saying this is completely out of the question, but I'm saying that this is the flip side. And all of a sudden, we get a large influx of bad fit customers, right? And bad fit customers are then going to try it on their local business and complain that it doesn't work because it won't really work for that. And that's going to negatively influence our brand. So we look then at this $170 starter tier that we have and say, this is great because it disqualifies a bunch of really bad fits that are going to eat customer support time, my time training them, all this overhead and mental well-being. And that is going to be an opportunity cost that could have been better spent in servicing our existing content strategists that were like, yes, these are ClearScope hodlers for the long haul. And that would be really painful and a shame. So it's weird, but that's exactly how we think.
The point you had on, so it is a time suck dealing with some of this stuff, but you had a point on how it also influences mental well-being, which I think is an underrated point. It's like, you've only got so many hours in a day. You've got so many years, you're working on this thing. We have a principle at Omniscient. It's called, this should be fun. So if at any point we're hating our lives and hating what we do, we're like, well, why are we doing this? And I think that bad clients and bad fit customers can insidiously make that creep up into your life. And it's just much more fun to work with awesome clients who also like you and tell everybody. And it's just like this win-win situation. So I don't know. I felt like that was a good point. And is that something that because you have an agency or you built an agency before ClearScope, do you think you took that lesson from actually having to deal with clients on a very high touch level, or how did you pull this lesson into ClearScope?
Yeah, I think that honestly, a lot of that has to do with my co-founder's clarity on what ClearScope is and what we like and what we don't like. And I guess in terms of frameworks, an interesting framework to sit down and think about has been Myers-Briggs. I don't know if you know Myers-Briggs, but Myers-Briggs, he would be considered the mastermind or an INTJ, which is introverted, intuitive thinking and judging. The flip side of those letters would be extroverted, sensing, feeling, and perceiving. So I am a extroverted, sensing, thinking, and perceiving. So we basically overlap on the T, but for, at least the framework model, we're then completely different on all of the other things. And as somebody who struggles with shiny object syndrome, I have a hard time sussing out what is good and what is bad, because I can see that could be good. And, a very early example would be that some people a lot of people will ask us like, hey, we want domain authority in like the competitor review in a ClearScope report. And go up to my co-founder and be like, hey, people want domain authority. And then I'm like, I mean, I could see why people want domain authority. That makes sense. And then he'd be like, no, we're not doing domain authority. I'm gonna be like, all right, we're not doing domain authority. I'm like, right back to, our customers who have been asking for it. We're not doing domain authority. And then they're like, and I'll be like, okay, well, like, why aren't we doing domain authority? It's like, domain authority is bunk. It's a metric that, tools have made up that isn't even properly sanctioned by Google. So what we want people to trust is the quality of our recommendations. And I don't trust domain authority, so I'm not going to give domain authority. Plus, domain authority is an SEO thing. And we want to make our tool very friendly to writers, right? People, like a writer looks at domain authority and they get perhaps anxious. And they're like, okay, what does that mean? So we just never included domain authority. And that was that. So that's a long-winded way of saying when we got started with our agency, I was the non-technical guy. So I went out and wined and dined people and made the sales. And he was the product of consulting. I mean, yeah, we would sit down and strategize on client work stuff. But ultimately, he would be the one who created the 50 to 100 page deliverable because we scrutinize technical SEO for large websites. You can imagine DoorDash has hundreds of thousands of pages. And that's also where we made our margins, because if we could go in and incrementally improve each page by 10% by making a change that affects the entire template of pages, then that's a lot of pages and a lot of revenue for the customer. So we could charge 6 figures easily, and it would be like a drop in the bucket for a lot of these clients. And so from the very early days, though, he has had the clarity to say, hey, we do SEO for large websites, right? That's it, because large websites value SEO more. They tend to. And I think that he just has a lot of clarity behind what he believes is best for the company because of its of focus and other intangible things. And I just trust his gut and his instinct. And a lot of this comes back down to the intangibles, right? I think that you could sit down and A/B test the color of a button, or you could kind of gut intuition and say maybe there shouldn't be a button in the first place. There should be something else. And I think that he's just really good at that, whereas I struggle a lot more with that, which is why, back to the Myers-Briggs framework, I think we work together really well because he brings a lot of synthesis and opinion and gut feel to the table, whereas I bring more heuristics and experiential stuff, which is the difference between, in the Myers-Briggs framework, an intuitive and a sensing. A sensing is oh, what's the data say? What's my experience like? An intuitive is more I feel the world should be like this because that's just how I feel, kind of deal. And so that's where we both have that flavor, and then we cross on the T, right? And so we're able to say, okay, why? And then there's a rational explanation. It's okay, yeah, we'll go with that. That seems good.
That's awesome. You and I are the same type of founder, I think. And it's remarkable how just finding your complement, how much that helps. Because what I've realized is I don't have a lot of the judiciousness and sort of meticulous focus on operations and feasibility, but I have all these wacky ideas and just a ton of energy to run with them. So when David and I get together, David and I have the same goals and the same values and the same principles, but we have totally different ways of working. And if we were trying to mediate and meet in the middle, we would both be a diluted versions of ourselves. But if we can both let our freak flags fly then we can basically come together and clash it out and end up with the best possible product.
Yes.
So yeah, I relate to that heavily. Actually, there's a book on this. It's called Rocket Fuel. It's about
okay.
like, I think there's an innovator and integrator. It's kind of like the Steve Jobs and like Wozniak kind of thing. But I always think of it in the cooler framework, which is Mad Men. Have you watched that?
I've not watched it, but I've read like about it and stuff.
Yeah, there's the Roger Sterling, who's just like the, go-getter, gets the clients, does the marketing, sales, all that stuff. There's the Burt Cooper, who like is the operator, runs the business, makes sure they're making money and everything's like running properly. And then Don Draper, who's like the creative genius and just cares so much about the work that he sometimes forgets everything else.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is just like the ultimate for like an agency or even like a high touch, B2B business.
Oh, totally. Totally. I feel like my co-founder is like the Don Draper. He just comes up with stuff that is honestly like just completely sometimes out of the blue, but a lot of the times like just like, yeah, that is like perfect. It's like for the longest time, we struggled with this idea of like when in ClearScope, you improve your content quality for those of you that don't know. And you go from like a C+ to a B-. However, it was very like confusing at what point your piece of content would progress from a C+ to a B-. You just kind of had to include more concepts, and at some point it happened. And competitive tools would just say, oh, like use 3 more of these and you will progress. And people were giving us feedback like, hey, I want that to see that in ClearScope. And we just sat on that for like the longest time. So, oh, should it be a progress bar? But like a progress bar doesn't feel that great. And then one day you'd be like, oh, wouldn't it be great if it just like surrounded the content grid and like filled up? And I was like, oh yeah, that would be perfect. And then, we did it and feel really good about it. But there's all of these like little tiny things that it's just like this idea of, okay, like he'll like analyze something from 360 degrees and then some, right? It's like, okay, what does the customer want? Like, what do they say they want? What do they actually want? What if we just removed it, right? It's like, then they wouldn't be asking questions about it. Like, it's like, oh yeah, right. Or like, what if we just did it like this? And I'm like, oh, that's crazy, but maybe not. I don't know.
How do you guys, so you have customer requests, you have your own vision, and then you have Google too, because you're operating on, you're dependent on like how they rank things. Yeah. How do you keep ahead of trends in terms of like how Google is like determining what ranks and what content, sees the light of day? Yeah.
Honestly, we have a pretty strong guiding framework of what we believe Google is striving towards. Mm-hmm. Which ultimately, right, Google keeps saying it. It's like, oh, we're just trying to help the user find what they need. So it's like, okay, let's take that, right? Help the user find what they need. And then that then guides our product decisions, right? Is domain authority going to help the user find what they need? It's like, well, I mean, in this current like model and framework, it obviously plays a role, but in a farther future framework, maybe not at all, right? It's like domain authority is just, it doesn't mean that that's what's going to help the user find what they need. It's still a signal that this is likely to help the user find what they need, but not completely the like end path. So we sort of evaluate every decision on this internal guiding principle that Google keeps repeating. And we say, okay, is content that writes itself going to help the user find what they need? And then we look at the content that's been AI generated and we're like, no, it's really not. So this is not what ultimately is going to work. But then we'll say, oh, right, is monitoring the relevancy of your content over time going to help the user find what they need? It's like, yeah, certainly. So it's like, okay, we got to do something about content inventory monitoring, which we are certainly doing. But then, we'll throw out everything else there. People will then like come in and say, okay, can I do this? And can I do that? And oftentimes, right, in entrepreneurship, you'll hear the saying, the customer is always right. And it's like, not really, not at all. But you do need to make the customer feel heard and feel like they are right. So that is back to the intangibles of the brand. And so we'll always make the customer feel like their statements are heard and feel like we're listening. But when push comes to shove, we will say explicitly to some customers that our philosophy is this, and their suggestion or their point just doesn't seem to jive with what we believe, and maybe we shouldn't be customers, or they shouldn't be customers of ours, right? Like a recent example that comes to mind is somebody's like, Bernard, we want ClearScope to help with meta descriptions. I have a pretty strong viewpoint on this from heuristics, anecdotal data, but there was literally this time in like Google Webmaster Tools where they had HTML improvements as a tab, and they had missing meta description as one of the HTML improvements. And one day it was gone, like from HTML, like missing meta description. Google just no longer considered that like a problem. And when you inspect Wikipedia, they don't even provide a meta description because they're just like, okay, well, Google's going to figure it out from the body of content on your page. And so then I'm like, this is, duh, like that's just what happened. So they'll go, okay, Bernard, like, well, I see meta description recommendations. And I say like, well, I believe that when you optimize the body of content using ClearScope, you're optimizing your meta description. Like it's just happening automatically. And they're like, I disagree. And I'm like, okay, well, I disagree with you. And if that's how it goes, then maybe, you should look for a tool that gives you recommendations on meta descriptions. And then, it's awkward, but it's like we're thinking about the long game. And it's like, if you're thinking about it like that, and we're thinking about it like this, then maybe it's not going to work. Yeah,
that makes sense. So given all of this understanding and kind of like the heuristics of Google's long-term game, plus kind of the data you've seen as ClearScope's founder and as an agency founder, if you were to start a blog today, how would you go about it? How would you think about that process?
Yeah, honestly, if I've learned anything about anything, it would be, you say start a blog in a fairly generic sense. I'm going to answer
from scratch.
Start a blog in a generic sense. I would just write about stuff that I personally care about. At the end of the day, why most projects, businesses, blogs fail is because the person loses interest in whatever it is that they're doing, right? And so I would optimize for consistency and longevity and understand that if I kept doing this because I really enjoyed doing this for the next 5 years, that, my content's probably going to rank for whatever it is that I'm writing about for the long game, right? It's all about the long game. It's like, okay, if we're going to now narrow it down and make it more, I guess, like ROI driven and actionable and say, okay, I want to start a blog with the purposes of ranking content in SEO to make affiliate money or something like that, then I would say, okay, well, let's study the emerging industries, like agnostic of my own passion, right? So it'd be like, okay, AI is taking off, and crypto or non-fungible tokens are taking off. So maybe that's a sector, right? So I do a lot of analysis on like Google Trends, figure out like what's trending, what's niche, and then say, okay, well, how big is that like market likely to be in the future? Therefore, search volume will obviously grow in that area because those are going to be the things that I think you could quickly capitalize on without much domain authority or even subject matter expertise because they're so green. And that's how I would like approach building a blog to make money in a short period of time.
That's cool. I'll just add, there's a couple of resources for the latter in terms of like finding those trends. There's like Google Trends, obviously. And then Brian Dean has this tool, Exploding Topics, I believe.
Yeah, Exploding Topics.
And then there's a newsletter from The Hustle called trends.co. So I think they do a lot with search volume as well, but generally speaking, they just try to find like emerging trends in terms of like businesses. Yeah. So if that's the route somebody would want to go, there's a bunch of resources out there. But to your point on the first one, in terms of like finding something you're actually interested in, I will say that we found Kava. It's like this emerging trend. There's Kava bars. There's one here in Austin. Of course,
yeah, I've had some.
So we're like, all right, we can jump on this. There's not a lot of content in the space. And we did. We wrote like 10 blog posts. They all ranked. We're ranking for what is Kava and Kava bars and all this stuff. And we got bored. We don't do it anymore. So I think to your point, it's something that you kind of have to be interested in, or it has to be just like purely like what you're doing. So this wasn't like our day job. This wasn't our full-time thing. So when push came to shove and other, things, came on our agenda, it's like that took the back burner. So in terms of like how I can actually find time to functionally write good content, it's got to be about stuff I care about. There's no other way.
Totally. But yeah, I mean, if your jam is sort of like, rank and rent or, flip it, like rank it and flip it, then yeah, I think those are all like CBD, right? 3 years ago was just like, you got in, you wrote stuff, you promoted the affiliate, and a lot of people got out. And a lot of people didn't, got burned by Medic update and or whatever. But it's if you wanted to really get into the weeds of SEO, that's how I did my journey, right? I kind of built a private blog network by buying expired domains, restoring them, really, writing about all kinds of stuff that I could care less about, because then you start to just manage the strategy, hire freelance writers to do give them clear scope reports. And that in of itself is like an interesting exercise, and I can get excited about that. But I think nowadays that would be hard for me to get excited about.
It's going to be hard to get excited about. I also think it's getting harder and harder to make that a smashing success, because I think that with Google's kind of like long game goals of like creating the best possible search experience and surfacing the best content, it's going to be harder and harder to do that if you're not truly an expert. But also like on the receiving end, like, I don't know about you, or most people, I can tell when somebody knows what they're talking about. Like when you read a post, especially on like a fitness blog is the best example.
Yeah.
When it's like some healthline.com BS, and when it's like somebody who actually has done the research and like has, hit the gym and all this stuff. And like, I'm going to follow the latter. And granted, the former may rank for a little bit, but I just feel like as a business, like if you're really in it for the long game and not doing this like repeatedly, if this is your one blog, I just feel like that's the way it kind of has to go. Like it has to come from that authority.
I agree. And that's where, again, back to your question, if you were to start a blog, that's why I'm like, yeah, you gotta be passionate about it. You gotta be in it for the long haul, because I see a future algorithm. I don't know how far down the line, but that basically is so good at figuring out what's suspicious and what's not, right? I'm sure people listening here have Googled best blah and been presented with pages of junk that like maybe you're aware of, or maybe you're not like consciously aware of. Like, this is like pros, cons, like this stock images, like this is junk. It's like, yeah, I think that stuff's just going to die like some point in the future. And, the person holding the whatever they're reviewing, look at that and be like, yeah, that person like actually bought that or got a copy of that and read it and reviewed it. And, like Amazon's struggling with fake reviews and whatever, but people are going to figure out like what's signal and what's noise. And then, in 5 years, if you wanted to game the system, which is sort of like, identifying the newest, hottest trend and sort of, it's like kind of gaming the system, that stuff, those loopholes are shortening in cycle. And so when we think about SEO at ClearScope for ourselves, we think, okay, like how are we going to provide unique perspectives on things happening in content and SEO that we find interesting? And perhaps that doesn't get that much search volume right now. But if it's a unique perspective that comes true, then it will rank. Right?
And you're like
because
you're positioned in front of that wave too. So you just have like that first mover advantage. And then you've got like all these terms that everybody else is going to be competing for.
Yes.
So that's a brilliant move. But on the point of like like the best blank and affiliate model, I also feel like conversion rates differ depending on like who is telling you that information too. It's like I've searched for all those things, and like sometimes I just want a quick answer, and like whatever, I'll use that to like surface the top 3 or 4 that I see. But think about it if that's coming from somebody who you already follow, like an Oprah or Tim Ferriss or Joe Rogan. It's like you've already built the trust. You listen to their podcast or whatever. And when Tim Ferriss recommends you his fucking cricket protein or Joe Rogan recommends you like his sauna or whatever, you're like, okay, they do that. Like that is their brand. So like I'm going to inherently trust what they're hawking right now, you know?
Totally. And so I do honestly think influencer marketing, a lot of people are going to call it all kinds of different stuff, but I think influencer marketing is the future to a certain degree, right? It's like that. Obviously search is still very relevant and changing, but you buy from the people that you trust and respect. And whether that's a Tim Ferriss who has a large audience, or your friend who texts you, or your mom, right, in this like private message, like, hey, check this out. That's where purchasing decisions are happening, right? 5 years ago, you might have gone to wired.com or techcrunch.com and read, the front page because you wanted more stuff, more like news in your life. I feel like we're in an era where people just don't do that, right? They'll go to a piece of content within a publication because their very close friend, community they subscribe to, influencer, linked them to that specific article. And so I do feel like when we talk about, I guess, like growth hacking, I think the era of growth hacking and crappy-ish products are dying, right? Because people don't recommend that. And like growth hacking is just like, information flows too smoothly. And you hear, product-led growth. It's like, isn't that just a fancy way of saying like your product doesn't suck? Like people actually.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
That's a term that is just like, it hasn't bothered me per se, because it is a good practice, but it's like what? And the companies who are saying they're product-led growth are never ones with good products. That's something that I've noticed too. So a little pet peeve there.
Yeah. And it's like, I don't know, like, influencer marketing. It's just like, I guess you could just say it's just word of mouth, right? It's like, obviously you could sponsor some stuff and we've done it, but it's only from people who were already like talking about ClearScope to begin with. And we're like, why don't we pay you some money to like talk about it some more?
Cool. I got to wind down pretty soon. I'm going to try to hit this jiu-jitsu class. We were talking about all this like new stuff and like how you got to like suck at it, which like there's not a worse thing to suck at than something like jiu-jitsu, I feel like. So this will be intense. But one more question that's related to what we were just talking about with influencers and blogs and authority. Do you have any go-to kind of favorite blogs, podcasts, influencers that you follow? It could be in the SEO and content space. It could be whatever. Take that as you will.
Yeah, I would say that I'm not going to list anyone specifically, but just sort of give you a framework, which is that you should just identify the people that works for you, right? I feel like a lot of people ask this sort of like question, and I could name people in crypto, or I could name people in, SEO, but it's like, if you don't care about SEO and you don't care about crypto, it's not really going to matter. And I would say that Twitter as a general like channel, I'm actually like bullish on Twitter because I feel like Twitter is seeing some sort of a resurgence of like popularity. Like people are more active on it. There's just interesting stuff. And it's like, you can pick and choose your own adventure on Twitter. And you don't have to like try to grow your own following to get value out of Twitter. So I would say that I think that's an interesting place should you want to get like, influencers or people that you might care about, like exposure to them. And then I think that will lead you down this potential rabbit hole of back channels, which are going to be private communities, whether they're paid or free or invite only, that you might want to go deeper in. And so, I'm in an SEO community that's paid, that's private, like at least 2 of those, and then like 3 of them that are free. And then I'm in some crypto ones, those invite only, that kind of stuff. And it's just because I am interested in like those fields and I do derive value from those. But honestly, the best stuff is usually the stuff that you're never going to hear about. And you're only going to get like invite access, like stuff is like, those are going to be like the best ways to get your like fill of information. And I think that you only get to those when you're really passionate, engaging with the community and whatever it is that you're doing. And so I guess the best way to say it is that the cool back channels are the ones that you like never hear of.
I love that. I'm bullish on Twitter too. That's really cool. So do you have any kind of last words, or like, do you want to point to places that somebody can find you online, like what your Twitter is? Obviously clearscope.com, right?
.io. Yes.
.io.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to follow what I guess, at Clearscope is our Twitter, at Bernard J. Huang is my Twitter. Pretty responsive on it, but also be fairly, let's say, professional on Twitter. You're not going to see much action if you're looking for action, because it's sort of the problem with Twitter is that you could get canceled very quickly if you just said something slightly off. So the best way that I found is that, you have like a pseudo anonymous Twitter, and like a lot of the best news sources and stuff come from pseudo anonymous like accounts, right? Because they don't have to worry about the repercussions of saying something potentially offensive. Yeah, I would say those are going to be the best ways to find me.
Awesome. Sounds good. Well, thank you, Bernard.
No, thank you. It was a complete joy chatting, as it always is with you.